I think good afternoon, everyone. I can see people are still joining us online, but we'll get underway so we don't lose too much time. Thank you all for coming along this afternoon to the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration webinar that we're co-hosting with the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. This afternoon's session is on the politics of solidarity and anti-racism in settler colonial contexts. My name is Sarah Madison. I'm one of the co-directors of the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration. I'm coming to you today from some disputed land between Bunurong and Gunai Kurnai country. So I acknowledge both Bunurong and Gunai Kurnai elders in my place on the territory today. But before we get the webinar underway, I want to invite Uncle Tony Garvey from the Wurundjeri Nation to welcome us. The University of Melbourne's Parkville campus is, of course, on Wurundjeri territory, and that is a relationship that is profoundly important and increasingly more appropriately recognised by the university. Thank you, Uncle Tony. Thank you so much, Uncle Tony. I've reflected often since the start of this pandemic that I think for a lot of us, and I think particularly at this stage of lockdown restrictions in Melbourne, where the only way we can connect with other people is by being outside. And I hope that in being able to connect with one another outside, people are also taking the opportunity to think and connect and reconnect with the fact that we are on Wurundjeri territory, and to honour and respect the great care for this country that you just mentioned in your welcome. We are all deeply grateful and pay our deep respects to you and all the other elders past and present of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our speakers very, very briefly. I am very, very lucky to call these two women my colleagues in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Our first speaker this afternoon is going to be Professor Karen Farquharson, who is a sociologist who has worked extensively on the sociology of race. And following Karen will be the newly minted Dr. Kim Ali, who is a wonderful colleague of ours, also in the School of Social and Political Sciences, working in political science, who's done some very interesting work looking at settler colonialism in Israel, Palestine. Together, Karen and Kim are going to reflect on the vexed question of the politics of solidarity and anti-racism in settler colonial contexts. A couple of small housekeeping notes before I invite Karen to speak. For those of you who need to access closed captioning, that's available to you if you click on the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. Questions, we'll have some time for questions and answers towards the end of the session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will try and move through as many questions as I can in the 15 or so minutes that we'll have available before we wrap up at 6 o'clock. Ellie and Claire, my wonderful colleagues, are also in the background and will be able to help you with any technical queries. You can also pop those into the Q&A. If you're having any challenges, and they will do their best to help you. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I see that we've got just over 200 and we've got 210 people here to listen to you. Wonderful women this afternoon. So Karen Farquharson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the invitation. And thanks to Uncle Tony for his warm welcome. I come to you today from Wurundjeri land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'm delighted to be here. So this talk is about racism in Australia and racism in general, with examples from my research and my experiences of studying racism here in Australia, mainly. I'll discuss racism and some of its key features here. I'll discuss my own positionality and some of my own research as a means to explore how one navigates studying racism in Australia as a migrant, as an outsider, as a Black person, but not as an Indigenous person. I aim to be an ally to Indigenous Australians in my work, but I'm not Indigenous and I cannot speak for Indigenous peoples. Nevertheless, I think it's important to understand racism in Australia as multifocal, but with particular systemic and ongoing effects for First Nations. Philomena Assed, a Dutch sociologist, has argued that Black people in white-dominated societies have developed a sophisticated understanding of racism from having to deal with it. And so that to understand racism, you can gain critical insights from asking those who have to navigate it. My experiences as a Black woman have shaped my understandings of race and racism and influenced what questions I think are important to study and how to study them. My social class, my cultural background, and my experiences of mobility have also shaped my understandings of race and racism, as has my sociological training. So I've lived in four nations for extended periods of time, each a settler colony, each with its own racial formations. All of these places have shaped my views on race and racism and my approach to research here. I was born in Jamaica, a light-skinned but not Black, but also not quite white person from a privileged family. Jamaica became independent from Great Britain in 1962, just a few years before I was born. So I was socialized into a newly formed nation with recently developed founding stories. Jamaica was initially settled by the Spanish and then the English. And I was taught in primary school that the indigenous populations had been the victims of genocide and that none remained. So the settler colonial project was complete. Jamaica is a country with a Black majority and one that was founded with a pride in Black power. Nevertheless, its colonial legacy meant that there's a racial stratification and multiple racial groups. I was an in-between category of a racial group, not white and not Black. I'd say in-between categories only exist and matter where they confer privileges, which they do in Jamaica. Race is a social construction, and race has been a feature of racialized societies for hundreds of years. According to Omi and Winnant, American sociologists, race is the outcome of a process of racial formation. Racial formation is the socio-historical process that creates racial categories and hierarchies and also reinforces them over time. And so to understand race, you have to understand its context. Different places have different understandings of race, what race is, and what racialized categories are. In Jamaica, race is rarely discussed. It's not a topic of conversation, but lighter-skinned people are privileged. My family wasn't Black, but we were part of this privileged light-skinned minority. For an individual person, race is a combination of our ancestry, how we identify, and how others identify us. It has elements of appearance, indigeneity, ethnicity, religion, culture, caste, and other racialized categories. Race has no biological validity. Genetic research has found that there is far greater genetic variation within so-called racial categories than between them. However, even though it has no biological validity, race has real material effects on all aspects of our lives. Some of us benefit from our racial category, others are disadvantaged. Much as we don't want to look at it this way, societies like Australia, the United States, South Africa, and Jamaica, the four places I've lived, and other places colonized by European settlers, were founded and organized around an ideology of white supremacy. This ideology says that white people are superior to others and more deserving. And this ideology makes it normal and right that white people should run things and own things. Since it was the founding ideology of many colonial societies, understanding that white people are to be given special privileges is imbued into their laws, regulations, norms, and practices. Even in Jamaica, a Black-dominated country, light-skinned people are advantaged due to racism. When I was 10, my family migrated to the United States, and I became Black. And with that, I learned that race was malleable and changeable with context. That's probably why racial formation theory resonates with me. The United States has a very different racial formation to Jamaica. And people like me were considered Black due to the one drop rule that said anyone with any African heritage is Black. There are many light-skinned Black people in the US just like me. And while there is colorism, we were all considered equally Black by the nation at large when I was growing up. Since that first migration, I've identified as Black, and others have usually identified me as Black. My curly hair, formerly dark, my brown skin, and my Jamaican background, and my previously Jamaican accent, blacken me. Americans are sort of obsessed with race. It is measured, tracked, debated, and discussed. Like all of the places I have lived, the US is a country that was founded in racism. For Americans, discussions of race are part of the everyday. This is very different from Jamaicans, who in my experience rarely discuss race and race-based privilege, even though it is on some levels understood. For me personally, when I migrated to the US, I went from a place of race privilege to a race disadvantage. And while my brothers and I became Black, my parents would never have identified themselves in that way. When I was in graduate school in sociology, I spent a year in South Africa. Like Jamaica, South Africa is a country with a Black majority. I arrived there in 1995, the year after apartheid officially ended, in a time of great hope and optimism. Every aspect of South African society was racialized during apartheid, from where you could live, to where you could study, to where you could work, to who you could socialize with. And even though the laws had changed after the end of apartheid, de facto apartheid remained. You can't dismantle a whole entire social structure by just having an election. South Africa was fascinating because it was trying to shift from being explicitly organized around white supremacy, where being white conferred enormous advantages and privileges, to being organized explicitly around an ideology of non-racialism. If you haven't read the South African Constitution, you can see the absolute shift in its focus. Seeing this shift in action was really interesting. How do you shift from having everything about everyone's life structured by their racial category to it not, particularly when most of the wealth and power would remain in the hands of a white minority, a minority who had lived incredibly privileged lives while their Black compatriots had very little? While I was there were numerous discussions around the shift from apartheid to non-racialism. It was discussed constantly and everywhere. And observing these discussions made me understand racial systems to be based in ideology and also to be changeable. In South Africa, the malleability of race was once again evident to me. Some people ascribed whiteness to me due to my Americanness, while others ascribed mixedness. No one ascribed Blackness. Again, I was a minority, but a privileged one due to my Americanness. Being American whitened me. I moved to Australia as a Black American woman. Race in Australia is very different to the other places I have lived. Here, I'm still Black, but my Blackness is not really discussed. And sometimes it's not perceived, especially as I've gotten older. I've been studying race and racism in Australia for 20 years. I was interested in the sociology of race before I migrated here. And when I arrived, I was surprised at the racial dynamics of the settler colony. And before I continue to talk about that, I'm going to just give a bit of an aside here and talk about, I'll just define racism. So racism is the outcome of beliefs that one social group is superior to others. In the case of Australia, it's the outcome of white supremacy as a structuring ideology. Racism manifests interpersonally and structurally, targeting racialized others. It is intersectional, meaning that, for example, an African Australian cis woman will likely have different experiences of racism than an Indigenous queer man or an African Australian non-binary person. Racism is enacted in the everyday through our institutions and through our interpersonal interactions. For example, when a child of African background is told by a teacher with a note of surprise, well, you write really well. Or when a resume is treated differently because the name on it is non-European. Or when an Aboriginal woman gets arrested for public drunkenness, but a white woman does not. Or even when we just think differently of somebody once we know their race. Racism is both very personal because it is targeted at individuals, and not personal at all because it is systematic and affects all people in particular racial categories. A few years ago, I was teaching a class on race, ethnicity, and migration, and the topic of the week was racism at work. And we were discussing how racism operates in the workplace in one of my tutorials. One of my students said that at her workplace, they routinely rejected applications from people with non-Anglo names without even reading them. The applicants would never have known that they'd been affected by racism, but they had been. They could have been perfectly well qualified, but the organization would never have known. Racism is unjust and unfair. So Australia was explicitly founded on an ideology of white supremacy. And this was operationalized with the aim of creating social cohesion around cultural homogeneity through shared Anglo-Celtic whiteness. And there were two aspects of this. One, around the management of Indigenous peoples, and the other around the management of non-white migrants. The state and its legal system and its constitution were set up to exclude Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and deny their humanity. And the state's ability to treat Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples separately and differently remains legal today. Racism was also extended to non-white migrants at the time of Federation. One of the first acts of the new Australian Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act 1901, colloquially known as the White Australia Policy. This prevented people who were not considered white from migrating to Australia. And although the category of who might be white expanded over the 20th century, particularly after World War II, migration was still limited to those who looked white and who were expected to assimilate into Australian whiteness over time. And although it was dismantled in the 1970s, its legacies remain. And I have a personal story about that, which is that one of my mom's cousins from the West Indies migrated here as a 10-pound pom in the 1960s, maybe late 50s, maybe early 60s, and had to prove her whiteness. She had to provide photos of her grandparents. And so she found photos and she provided them, but they may or may not have been her grandparents. But it was operationalized to that level, with individuals having to prove their whiteness if they were from places like Grenada, which is where my mom was from. So racism is a problem in contemporary Australia as well. The most recent Scanlon Social Cohesion Survey, which is in 2020, found that over 1/3 of Australians agree that racism is a problem. And I think it was 59% of Chinese Australians agreed with that during the time of COVID. It's not surprising with the increase in anti-Asian racism we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And the most recent Challenging Racism Survey, which was I think 2015 to 2016, found that approximately 1/3 of respondents had actually experienced racism. So racism is a large social problem here. Yet it is largely invisible to many white Australians. Studying racism is hard because it's embedded in our taken for granted assumptions about how the world works and how it should work. Critical race theory argues that racism is normal everyday business and that change only occurs when it's in the interest of white people. This is called interest convergence. And this means it's actually very difficult to enact change, to enact real change that benefits the targets of racism. For racism to stop, it means that white people would no longer benefit from it. And this is a real barrier to change. There's also a separation in Australian academia between those who study Indigenous issues and those who study migrants. And this is a historical thing. And I have fallen mainly on the side of studying migrants. And I think that also is I think that there are commonalities between anti-Indigenous racism and anti-migrant racism, particularly anti-Black racism for African people. But because of that separation, they're rarely studied as types of racism together. I think one of the interesting features of Australian racism is that we don't like to talk about it. It's almost taboo to discuss race here. In my experience, white people in particular don't like to discuss being racialized or to even think of themselves as white, and they frequently minimize or deny racism. I would say this denial serves to maintain the unspoken racial status quo. There's been quite a lot of research on the denial of racism in Australia, including by Alana Lenton, Jackie Nelson, and Kevin Dunn, and other people, and also by me, although I don't think I've used that term. My research has found that denial occurs even when the racism is absolutely blatant. For example, Tim Marchbanks and I wrote a paper in 2006, 15 years ago, on media discourses surrounding the incident where Australian cricketer Darren Lehman racially vilified the Sri Lankan cricket team. There was no dispute about whether the incident took place. Lots of people witnessed it. However, in the media reports, some of the reportage situated Lehman as the victim of over-the-top policing of what was a minor incident. It was almost worse to be accused of being a racist than to say something racist. So as I said, we wrote that paper 15 years ago, and this was the same circumstances were echoed this year when Adelaide Crows football player Taylor Walker was similarly found to vilified, this case an Indigenous player, Robbie Young, perhaps even using the same epithet that Lehman used. Again, as with Lehman, people came out of the woodwork to deny that Walker was a racist, and the player he vilified, Robbie Young, was expected to forgive him and help him to be better. The dynamic of the Walker incident was very, very similar to Lehman. Again, it was almost worse to be called a racist than to be a racist. Robbie Young actually attended Walker's tearful recorded apology to him. And if you're interested, I recommend Googling it. It's quite remarkable. As ABC reporter and Indigenous former AFL player Tony Armstrong said on ABC News Breakfast, quote, "It is always on Indigenous people, always taking the high road and always having to extend the olive branch out and be the ones to help. Even then, in the wording we heard in the apology, Taylor will be the one leaning on Robbie," close quotes. Lehman's post-playing career has been very successful, showing no long-term impact from his racism. And I would be surprised if Walker, a former captain of the Adelaide Crows, experiences any repercussions beyond his suspensions from playing. As a non-white person, there are politics around doing research on race. Structurally, non-white people aren't generally in a position of power to enact social change in white-dominated societies. And yet we are the ones who seem to be most likely to do this type of work, both in general and in academia, whether we are Indigenous or not. To me, it's very obvious that society is organized hierarchically by race and that non-white people are systematically disadvantaged in numerous ways. But it's not clear to me about how to go about changing that. There are also particular challenges with studying anti-Indigenous racism as a non-Indigenous person. If you want to do research in this space, you need to have a clear understanding of the power dynamics involved, which can be murky, and the potential ways in which your research will be used, whether positively or negatively. So this makes studying anti-Indigenous racism particularly challenging. And compounding it is that anti-Indigenous racism has meant that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have experienced multi-generational disadvantage, which is compounded over time. And this disadvantage has affected the numbers of Indigenous people moving into research careers, while also simultaneously reducing the number of people with Indigenous knowledges as an alternate way of understanding the world. And I'll note here that my colleague Nikki Moody has written about Indigenous higher education futures, highlighting some of the complexity of Indigenous higher education. The power dynamics mean that First Nations people have usually had research done to them, not with them or for them, leading to a lack of trust in many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities regarding researchers. And yet there are not enough trained Indigenous researchers to do all the work that needs to be done. Doing research in this sphere is both crucially important if we want to enact change, but challenging to do. I think for non-Indigenous folks like myself who want to be allies, must be done in genuine collaboration with Indigenous peoples. So how have I navigated things? As a Black woman, I'm always aware of my positionality. Not only have I studied racism, I've also personally experienced it. I don't have the solution for how to study racism in Australia as a non-white migrant. Personally, I've managed it one project at a time. I'll discuss just two examples. Some years ago, I was a chief investigator on the Osud Media Project, which was the Sudanese media treatment project. The Osud Media Project was an ARC linkage-funded media intervention led by Michael Goenda, Dennis Muller, David Nolan, Tim Marchbanks, and me. It aimed to provide journalism training to a group of Sudanese and South Sudanese migrants so that they could better engage with mainstream media, and if they so desired, they could develop their own media. I was the only Black CI on the project, but despite identifying as Black, I am not from an African background, and my experiences of being Black in Australia are very different from African migrants, most of whom are much more visibly Black than I am. The project emerged in response to negative media representations of Sudanese migrants around the 2007 election and the murder of a young South Sudanese man, Leif Goni, who was beaten to death in 2007. Goni was walking home one night when he was attacked by two men who basically went out to find a Black person to kill or to bash. I don't know if they intended to kill, but they were looking for a Black person to attack. It was an overtly racist killing. And when his murder was reported on, it was reported that the police thought he'd been killed by an African gang. There was no such gang. As far as I can tell, there have been no African gangs, despite the notion of African gangs coming up in the media periodically. Our project aimed to improve reporting on African communities by empowering African Australians to speak for themselves in the media, and by linking journalists working for mainstream media organizations with people in the African community who collaborate on the report, to collaborate with them on the reports. To mitigate the lack of African Australian representation on the research team, we established a steering committee with members from the African Australian community to help drive the project. I think that because the project was our creation, not the community's creation, the steering part didn't work as well as it should have. And so if we were doing that differently, I think we would be collaborated from the inception before we wrote the grant instead of after. My positionality affects the kinds of questions I ask and the theoretical perspectives I bring to the work. As someone who has experienced racism, I have insights into what it feels like to be targeted in that way. And I think people are more likely to speak openly to me about racism than they would be if I wasn't Black. The Ausud Media Project found that African Australians experience higher levels of public racism every time that there is a negative report on their community in the media. And I think having me on the project team shaped the part of the research exploring racism, and that might have been missing if I wasn't there. My second example is the Koori Energy Efficiency Project that I was part of a team with as well. The Koori Energy Efficiency Project, or KEEP, was led by Rowan Bedgood at Swinburne Uni for the research part of it, along with me, Gina Milgate, Aaron Perenyi, Denny Meyer, and Claire Johansson. Gina was the Aboriginal Cultural Advisor on the project, providing critical feedback to the research team on how to ethically engage with the project in a culturally appropriate way, in addition to helping with the research, to collaborating with the research. KEEP was part of a Commonwealth-funded low-income energy efficiency project scheme. The low-income energy efficiency project scheme invited tenders for programs to help low-income people manage their energy use better. And KEEP was a project that was applied for by Kildonan Uniting Care, a local NGO that aimed to assist Aboriginal people in Victoria to better manage their energy use and bills. KEEP was a very interesting project that was organized around a shared leadership and decision-making model between Kildonan Uniting Care, Swinburne as the research partner, and 3 Aboriginal organizations. Those organizations were AAL, which is Aborigines Advancement League, Ngwala, and VACA, which is the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency. Our part of it, the Swinburne part of it, I was working at Swinburne at the time, was in charge of the research and the evaluation. The project was truly a collaboration between the Aboriginal organizations who co-designed the service and the research and delivered the service and collected the research data, and Kildonan and Swinburne. Feedback from the partner organizations was that the project was culturally appropriate and genuinely tried to help Aboriginal people in Victoria to better manage their energy use and bills. The project was underpinned by an ethos that Aboriginal organizations are best placed to deliver services to Aboriginal people, many of whom do not trust government to come into their homes. And this was actually also one of the findings of the project. The Aboriginal people who participated were wary of government, and I don't know that the project would have been a success if the Aboriginal organizations hadn't been the ones to actually provide the service and actually do the research. Others, such as Carlson and Fraser, have found similar distrust of settlers and identified Indigenous spaces as alternative sources for care. And I think that's what the KEEP project did and why it worked well. To finish up, I'll just make a brief comment on what's the impact of me being non-white in these projects. I think my positionality as a Black researcher shapes all aspects of my research, from my ontological position to my methods, to the questions that interest me, to my interpretations of the data. It's central. However, if you listen to my examples, they've all been collaborative. Almost all of my projects are collaborative. And in those projects, I'm usually the only one or one of two non-white researchers. I bring to those projects a critical lens, looking at power dynamics and their consequences. And I think my presence strengthens my collaborations and their contributions to understandings of racism and possibilities for anti-racism. And I will stop there.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Karen. What an interesting set of reflections on the work that you've done in these complex and sometimes very fraught spaces. Dr. Kim Alley, would you like to take the floor? I will hand over to you now.
Sorry, let me just get myself organised here. And okay, alrighty. Sorry. All right, thank you, Karen, and thank you everybody for coming today. Before we start, I do want to also acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Naarm, or Melbourne, the land of the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. This land has never been ceded. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I want to acknowledge Aboriginal elders past and present and any other Indigenous people who might be joining us in the forum today. So just to briefly introduce myself, as Karen mentioned, my name is Kim Alley. I am a Murri woman from North Queensland. My grandfather's people are from Gudjil country up around Charters Towers. And I'm now here working at the University of Melbourne. So today, the focus of my presentation will be on the politics of solidarity and relational ethics of working and researching in the occupied Palestinian territories as an Indigenous activist and researcher. So I want to start this presentation by talking about something that actually happened back in 2008. In December 2008, the Popular Committee Against the Wall from the Palestinian village of Bil'in in the occupied West Bank and the Israeli Anarchists Against the Wall were jointly awarded the Karl von Ostensky Human Rights Medallion in Berlin. The award, named for the 1935 German Nobel Peace Prize winner Karl von Ostensky, excuse me if I have not pronounced that correctly, who was a journalist and pacifist who died in the Nazi concentration camps. This is an award which is awarded every year for outstanding service in the realisation of basic and human rights. In their speech at the award ceremony, a representative of the Anarchists Against the Wall noted that as activists, they were originally reluctant to accept a prize for political activism, saying we would prefer not to be singled out for glory and receive gratitude for what we feel is duty. Our duty. The Anarchists Against the Wall representative, however, stated that despite this, they would accept the award because, and this is a bit of a long quote, but so bear with me. They said, here on this podium, just as in the olive groves of the West Bank, our primary moral duty is not to maintain ideological purity, but rather to stand with Palestinians in their resistance to oppression. We recognise the importance of garnering international support for the ongoing struggle. We believe that standing here is a direct continuation of the blocking of bulldozers, standing side by side with the stone throwers or running away from tear gas, along with the young and the elderly protesters. They went on to say, here, as in the olive groves, we are not equal partners, but rather occupiers who join the occupied in their struggle. We are aware of the fact that for many, the participation of Israelis in the Palestinian struggle serves as a stamp of approval. But in our eyes, this partnership is not about granting legitimacy. The Palestinian struggle is legitimate with or without us. Rather, the struggle is an opportunity for us to cross in actions rather than words, the barriers of national allegiance. So for myself, as an Indigenous activist and researcher, this encapsulates not only what it means to be in solidarity with those in struggle, but also the relational ethics that should inform that solidarity, as well as the work we do as researchers. Both solidarity and research exist in systems of power. There are no neutral spaces in politics or research. Therefore, whether as activists or researchers or both, it is important we ask ourselves what it means to talk back to or talk up to power. This includes not only speaking up to the systems of oppression, racism and structural violence connected to the state, which were built by capitalism, colonialism and imperialism, but also the systems of oppression, racism and structural violence that can be found within the context of the academy. It is recognising that the academy has historically conducted research about, not with, Indigenous peoples and their cultures, interpreting both through a Western lens while downplaying or ignoring Indigenous knowledge systems and practices. As an Aboriginal academic, Lester Irabina Rigney has noted, historically research relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia have been framed around the research priorities of the researcher rather than the needs, interests and the priorities of the Indigenous communities. This research has employed often inappropriate research processes which lacked appropriate cultural sensitivity, including in relation to ethics and protocols. It also often downplayed Indigenous knowledge, failing to consult or involve Indigenous communities in design, facilitation and publication of research. This has also been the case with other Indigenous peoples and communities around the world, including in Palestine. Over the last 50 years, however, here in Australia, we have started to see important transformations in research practices, with universities developing ethic procedures and protocols designed to ensure informed consent, confidentiality, dignity and privacy for individuals and communities participating in research projects. While all of these things are important, we also need to recognise that ticking the boxes off on an ethics application is not enough. Within academia, a positive empirical approach still often prevails, which tends to consider individuals and communities as subjects who can provide the researcher with information and knowledge. When working with Indigenous communities, whether in Australia, Palestine or elsewhere, this approach should be rejected. As researchers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, we need to go beyond not only what is encapsulated in ethics reviews, but also seek to develop mutual respect, connectedness between ourselves and the communities we're working with, ensuring that Indigenous peoples are equal participants in the research that we're conducting, and that this research is reciprocal in nature. This involves not only engaging in thoughtful research, but also being accountable to the communities that we're working with. It includes recognising Indigenous knowledges and methodologies, as well as the longevity of Indigenous struggles against colonisation. As such, it requires us to locate our solidarity and our research within Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, self-determination and justice. This means when undertaking research, we should ask ourselves, what is the actual purpose of our research? Does it benefit the communities we're engaging with? Does it help to raise the voice of those communities? Does it improve or extend their claim to sovereignty and self-determination? Does it improve or extend their political, social and economic rights? Does it involve community members in the design and development of the research? As Aboriginal researchers, such as Professor Marie Toombs has explained, any research should always include a benefit to the community that research is being conducted with. Whether working with our own communities or other Indigenous communities, our practice, whether as non-Indigenous or Indigenous researchers, should always be transparent, ethical and reciprocal. So in the Palestinian context, what has that meant for me as an Indigenous activist and researcher working with another Indigenous community? As a researcher, my academic focus has been on settler colonial histories and political violence, while also examining social movements for change and liberation, transnational activism and resistance politics. However, my interest in these areas of study came as a direct result of my political activism. Before becoming a researcher, I had been a political activist for more than 2 decades. When I first became active as an activist back in 1998, I was aware of the Israel-Palestine Palestine conflict, but my understanding was very limited. Over the next few years, I began to read more on Palestine, and the more I read, the more I saw the similarities between our struggle here in Australia within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and the struggle of the Palestinian people. In 2004, I was invited to apply to be part of an international all-women's group working on the ground in the occupied West Bank, which monitored and documented human rights abuses by the Israeli military and settlers, and also carried out other work such as accompaniment of Palestinian civilians to their farmlands and non-violent direct action resistance to the occupation. The group, the International Women's Peace Service, had been established in 2002 after the Palestinian village of Haras requested an international presence in the village. What was fantastic about IWPS, and still is fantastic about IWPS, is that it modelled the importance of being in partnership with not only the Palestinian people of Haras, but Palestinian people more generally, and in particularly many of the women's groups that we prioritise working with. As a grassroots organisation, IWPS was keen to foster links internationally between Indigenous working class women from around the world and Palestinians. After successfully completing the application process, I would spend the next 4 months living and working in Haras, which is a small village of about 2,000 people, approximately an hour north of Ramallah. To say that my experience in Palestine was profound is an understatement. It led me to return to Palestine for a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth time over the next decade. The second time I returned, I spent a year in Palestine, 6 months of which was spent with, again, working with IWPS, and 6 months working with a Palestinian NGO, Palestinian-run NGO in Ramallah. As an activist, I was required to put my solidarity into practice every day, with that solidarity taking many forms. Sometimes it was standing at checkpoints with Palestinians, monitoring what was happening at them. Other times it was accompanying Palestinian farmers to their land in the hope that an international presence would stymie any attacks by the Israeli military or settlers on Palestinians trying to simply farm their land. Sometimes it included attending Palestinian demonstrations against the wall and the theft of their land by the Israeli state, military and settlers. It also included documenting Israel's continuing military occupation, including house invasions, demolitions, the arrest of Palestinian children and adults, and the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Such documentation, while seeking to factually document such human rights abuses that were taking place, also sought to amplify the voices of Palestinians who had often been silenced. As Arundhati Roy once explained, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. When the world talks about Palestinians living under occupation and in refugee camps, whether it be the United Nations, the NGOs, the media, or the academy, it's often as dehumanized numbers. Specifically, how many Palestinians have been killed or injured, who are homeless or are dependent on aid. Such numbers, while telling us one part of the story, do not tell it all. They do not convey the personal struggles, the triumphs, the tears, the fears, the joys or laughter experienced on a daily basis by Palestinians living under military occupation. As one young Gazan writer explained in the aftermath of Israel's 40-day assault on Gaza in 2014, imagine what it's like to be converted into a number, that you are not unique, you're not a living, breathing, loving, laughing individual. You're merely a digit in a much larger number, one that just keeps on growing. Your entire life is reduced to a number. When a human being is made into a number, his or her story disappears. Nobody asks to hear the stories behind the numbers. Nobody uncovers the beauty of the lives they led, the beauty that vanishes with every attack, disappearing behind a thick, opaque wall of numbers. In documenting both the human rights abuses and the voices of Palestinians, I learned how important it was to just sit and listen and allow people to tell their story at their own pace. Sometimes this could take 30 minutes, sometimes it could take all afternoon, sometimes it would require multiple visits to the family or the village. Whether our interview took 30 minutes or 4 hours or several visits, it was important to develop relational trust with the Palestinians with who we were conversing. This meant recognizing that storytelling is rarely linear, and being sensitive to the fact that Palestinians, as with the case of Indigenous communities around the world, carry with them experiences of historical and contemporary trauma. Developing relational trust also meant respecting and engaging with cultural protocols, particularly those which related to hospitality. Hospitality is an integral part of Palestinian life and is shared even in the most adverse situations and times. Before I went to Palestine, I never actually drank coffee, only tea. Coffee, however, is an integral part of Palestinian hospitality, so I soon learnt to drink it. And today I do drink coffee, but only Palestinian-style coffee spiced with cardamom. As an activist with IWPS, my time was spent visiting many different villages and communities across the occupied West Bank. And during this time, I was also able to develop close friendships with many Palestinians and their families. This included spending time in Palestinian communities outside the weekly demonstrations or documenting the atrocities of the occupation. Sometimes this included simple things such as sharing a meal or drinking coffee and tea and chatting about the latest news in the family. Sometimes it would mean hanging out, helping to make za'atar, or learning to cook. One of my Palestinian friends was convinced that I could never make Palestinian food, so she was determined to teach me how to cook. Sometimes it meant going to weddings and spending time with the communities at those events. One time it was simply hanging out with Palestinian kids and learning the latest Palestinian slang words. As already mentioned, it is my history of activism which has informed my research and academic focus. It was my experience in Palestine in particular, the violence of Israel's military occupation that I saw on the ground, the daily violence of the checkpoints that were built built with the continuation of the occupation in mind to ensure the ongoing caging of Palestinians into Bantustans, the violent abduction of Palestinian children from their homes and schools by Israeli military occupation forces, the violence of house demolitions, some exploded by plastic explosives planted by the Israeli military, others bulldozed by armoured military bulldozers. It was the tear gas, the rubber bullets, the skunk or sewage water fired at Palestinian villages and into their houses, who dared call for an end, because they dared call for an end to the theft of their land and the Israeli military occupation. It was the escalating attacks on Palestinian villages by Israeli settlers, in particular, attacks which were at one stage described by then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a pogrom against Palestinian Arabs. This is what led me to my PhD question, which sought to understand the origins of political violence in Palestine and the evolution of its use by both Zionist settler colonists and the Indigenous Palestinian Arabs between the period of 1917 and 1939. In particular, I sought to fill a gap in the existing scholarship about the emerging and violence and its evolution, because overwhelmingly the existing scholarship on this issue had not sought to engage with a settler colonial analysis, nor had they sought to engage with a comparative examination of the use of political violence by Zionists or Palestinians and their respective political movements. Instead, existing studies overwhelmingly had focused separately on chronicling whether either the Zionist movement or the Palestinian national movement, and not sought to compare or analyse interplay and co-evolution of political violence or its relationship to settler colonialism. Such an examination of the emergence of political violence in the early 20th century in Palestine allows us to understand more deeply the root and cause of the ongoing conflict and the political violence that continues today. the politics of solidarity and anti-racism in settler societies requires us to understand, as I've already noted, that there are no neutral spaces in politics or research. As researchers, it requires us to ask, when undertaking research with Indigenous, marginalised or vulnerable communities, what is its purpose? It requires us to ask, does our research provide some benefit to the communities we are working with? Does it help us to understand the root cause of inequality, oppression and violence? Does it help us to challenge the power structures and transform the conditions under which Indigenous, marginalised and vulnerable communities live? As Palestinian American activist, academic and Native American studies scholar Stephen Salader has explained, solidarity is in an academic setting can be founded in any site of critical engagement or project of transformation which informs sustained decolonial politics. And it's this politics that I think we should be not frightened to engage with. Often in the academic setting, there's a positivist view that still remains that says, you know, there has to be this separation. But there is lots of increasing studies that are looking at the positivities and of outcomes that result with those engaged with research from an activist perspective as well. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I think Karen is coming back now too. Kim, if you want to leave your camera on at this point.
Sorry, yes, I clicked the wrong button.
That's all right. We'll take some questions. We don't have many in the chat at the moment. Don't be shy. Please, if you've got questions for Karen and Kim, or Karen and Kim, please do write in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The first comment, though, Kim, is for Dr. Kim. In fact, it specifies someone, Vicky Kerrigan, loving that set of questions that you asked or that you posed about how to assess whether research is of benefit to Aboriginal peoples that people are seeking to study. And could you please share that list? So that's an easy one. We can get the ISRC team to do that. Another question's just come in for Kim, but I think it probably, you could both reflect on this one. Sherry asks, Kim, I can hear the intensity of your experience in Palestine in your voice as you speak. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm wondering, what do you do to manage such intensity of experience? Kim?
Sorry. You'd think after a year and a half I know how to use Zoom. Thanks for the question, Sherry. Look, yes, I mean, working, I think, in communities and particularly in conflict zones can be a very intense experience. But I was very fortunate with the group that I worked with. We had non-violent direct training, non-violent direct action training, which helped us to, learn how to deal with situations and things like that. We also were very aware of that our role as activists was not to go there and showboat or to cause problems in the sense of making it more difficult for the Palestinian communities. Our role there was to not escalate situations. So it was very important to be able to intervene in a non-violent direct action way, while also being very aware of the situation and what our actions could bring about or not bring about. So often that also meant learning self-care. So I think self-care, particularly working in situations like that, is really, really important. So, I remember when I was there the first time, I think it was after about 6 weeks, it really first hit me. And I had to take time out, and basically by taking time out, it meant that I didn't engage. Often if we had to engage with Israeli occupation soldiers or things like that, because I knew I was at a stage of I may not have been able to hold my tongue. So it was better that one of my teammates did that instead. So you just have to be aware of the situation and be able to manage that and things like that, and take time out and have coping mechanisms.
Thanks, Kim. I think it's definitely challenging when you're doing what I think of as passionate research, to hold your emotions in check sometimes. A question for both of you that I think is really interesting from Mandy Trong. What do you think we should focus future racism, or where do you think we should focus future racism and anti-racism research? Karen, do you want to give Kim a second to catch her breath and maybe tackle that one first?
This one to start off with.
Thanks for your talk, Kim. I really enjoyed it. I think that there's actually quite a lot of stuff happening right now in the anti-racism space. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has come at a moment when people are noticing things like Indigenous deaths in custody. I think that there's a lot of movement around those spaces. And I think that there are a lot of NGOs out there actually who are doing very good work in the anti-racist space. I think one of the challenges, though, is finding effective interventions that disrupt racism, because racism is a wicked problem. There is no sort of simple solution. It's embedded in all aspects of our society. It's not as simple as saying, just don't be racist, because white people benefit from racism just by being, because the whole society is set up that way. So I think any kind of intervention, I think we have to be doing multiple things on multiple fronts, actually, to try and combat racism, and call it out when we see it.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Karen. And I think it's really important that, you know, we also see the linkages between the different struggles that are there. Obviously, for me, I definitely see a linkage obviously between the struggle of the Australian Indigenous community as well as Palestine, but it's also about the struggles of, for example, as Karen was talking about, the Sudanese community here, the other migrants, and we see racism is such a prevalent thing in Australia, as it is with many settler colonial countries. But I really agree with Karen's assessment that, you know, this is something that is often people just don't want to acknowledge or talk about in Australia, when it is something that we need to talk about and keep discussing and calling out. So, you know, I think there's lots of ways that we can be involved in different activisms on the street and activity. I know that's much harder at the moment because of the pandemic, but, you know, there's still forums and ways that people can educate themselves and be involved in and do those things. So I think, and looking at where we can link those different campaigns of resistance and campaigns against racism, I think is a really, really important thing. Thanks,
both of you. This next question relates to that, but speaking specifically about international solidarity. One of the audience members, Kim, has observed how important the face-to-face and relational aspect of your research has been. And Karen, you spoke about working always in collaboration, which also implies that degree of relationality. And I know we've all got used to Zoom and life on Zoom. But what do you think the implications are for that type of work in solidarity, international solidarity, in collaboration, in this post-COVID world? Well, hopefully post-COVID world.
I'll let Karen go first again.
Thanks, Kim. One of the silver linings maybe of the pandemic is that we now are able to attend seminars and conferences and things we wouldn't have been able to attend before because they just weren't accessible to people overseas. And Australia is very far away and it's very expensive to travel. You know, in that way, I think it's having that kind of shared discussions around racism. I would say that racism has shared features in all its around the world. It's organized around ideologies of superiority, and the dynamics of racism might be locally specific, but that there's shared similarities. And I think that there are ways to link up with people who are doing similar work overseas and strengthen it, strengthen our understandings of the dynamics. And that's a way of helping us to better tackle it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of ways. I mean, even before the pandemic, I mean, for example, in the Palestinian context, and even in relation to Indigenous communities here in Australia, it's not always possible. I recognise, you know, I was very fortunate to be able to go and be on the ground and spend time there. but I know that is not always a possibility for other people. People have, you know, families, they have jobs, they have all of these different things that, you know, impacts on their life. So as much as they may be supportive of an issue, they may not be able to just pick up and go, as I did. At that point of time, I was lucky I didn't really have anybody else to worry about except myself. And I think that's okay. I don't think you have to go to Palestine to be a Palestine solidarity activist or to do research on Palestine. Obviously, it will help, but I think you can also, you know, look at the issues. Research might be different, but I'm talking more as an activist now. You know, there's still ways for you to be involved in the campaigns and the international solidarity campaigns here in whether it be in Australia or any other country that you may be living in. And people can do it in many different ways. You know, it could be as simple as writing a letter to the paper, or it could be being involved in the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, the BDS campaign, or it could be, you know, working with your local Palestinian communities, and the same with Indigenous issues. Often not everybody you know, can go out to remote communities or Indigenous communities outside of their local areas or things like that. So yes, work with those communities in your local areas, you know, or be able to be part of the campaigns that are going on and follow the news and educate yourself. So there's lots of different activities people can do, whether it be in support of Palestine or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander campaigns here in Australia. Thanks,
Kim. This next question is specifically for Karen, but I'd be interested in both of your reflections on it. So let's talk about whiteness. The question is pointing out, Karen, that your definition of racism utilises the idea of a social group, one social group considering itself as superior and not necessarily whiteness. And they ask whether there could be racism in a context where historically whiteness has been absent. Yes. Trying to think where that might be.
I think it is possible. I've inhabited the post-colonial, maybe not quite so post-colonial world of places that were settled by Europeans, and so the dominant race has been whiteness, and Europeans settled a lot of the world. And I think, but I think it is possible to have a racialized system where the advantage are not white. And you know, I can't really comment on how things are in places I haven't researched. Everywhere where we have researched has been white dominated, but I totally see that that's possible. I think the dynamics of racism aren't about whiteness in particular. I think that's how historically it's happened here, but I can imagine other groups could also, could also be racist.
Yeah, no, I agree with Karen. I think it's entirely possible. Obviously, you know, as Karen said, we're working in a dynamics of where European settler colonialism was the dominant, you know, way of things happening here and in many other countries. So I think I was saying in a conference talk that I gave the other day, I was specifically utilising a theory that's being developed by some Canadian scholars in relation to penal nationalism and things like that. And there's one particular scholar who has some very good information, and which, you know, is going to be the basis of the paper that I'm going to be writing. She, however, placed you know, settler nationalism as a purely white thing, for example, which I think is a wrong way to look at it, because you have settler nationalism and settler colonialism that takes place in places, for example, within Asia. So Japan's colonization of the Korean Peninsula, for example, is one example. So again, I'm no expert on this area as well as Karen, but I do think, yeah, of course, within certain contexts. That's not to say I don't believe in the existence per se of reverse racism, but this is a different thing that we're talking about. We're talking about where race and the construction of race comes into who are the, you know, the dominant groupings in a society and things like that. Yeah.
Another question here for you, Kim, going specifically to the argument that Australia is that Israel is a settler colony, and the kind of denialism around that persists. And a question about whether you encounter a lot of that denialism in your own research and what the implications of that have been.
Yeah, there's still very much a lot of denial in it. I mean, part of, for example, my PhD, I have a whole chapter that looks at sort of settler colonial theory, and then, you know, half of it's sort of introducing what the theory is, and the second half is discussing it in relation to Israel and Palestine. And part of what I go through there is sort of the debate, particularly that happened in Israeli society in the 80s and 90s around the advent of the new historians. And what's been interesting, and Alain Pape writes about this as well in particular, he says, look, you know, originally there was a complete and utter denial of that Israel in any way could be a settler colonial state. And in general, that still exists within some quarters. But there has been more acknowledgement now than there used to be of, you know, many of the atrocities that took place during the Nakba and things like that. But in some sections, there's just outright denial. So, you know, Pape, for example, talks about this sort of new Zionist historiography that adopts and incorporates some of the information and writing back into history what actually happened in 1948, but it still maintains this traditional Zionist historiography of the establishment of the Israeli state. So yeah, so I think there's always a debate that's going on about it. It's possibly, I think, the narrative around Palestine in particular has changed in the last 15 years or so. I think there is much more. I remember, as I said, when I first became an activist, I knew very little. I knew that, you know, just the very basic details. And when I first encountered people who didn't, you know, have that perspective, who were very much pro-Zionist, it was hard for me to have that discussion with them because I didn't really know all the information and the facts and things like that. But as I educated myself more, it became easier to have those debates and have those discussions. But I also then noticed that publicly there started to be more understanding of the dynamics of the Israel-Palestine conflict compared to what it was when I first started getting involved in activism. So I think, you know, it's a positive thing that there has been changes, but there's still always going to be a pushback.
Yeah, it remains such a, you know, here in Australia too, such a heated debate about occupied Palestine. And, you know, I love the title of this session around the politics of this solidarity. In the ISRC, we encountered this a little recently when we posted a statement in solidarity with Palestinian activists earlier in the year, and encountered the predictable kind of pushback and heated letters to the dean and other senior members of the university leadership asking us to take the statement down, which we eventually did when we felt that it had served its purpose. But we were specifically pushed on the question of what a research unit was doing, making such a political statement. And I wondered, use my chair's prerogative for a minute, to just, if you could both reflect on that question for a minute. It strikes me working in this space that there's nothing that we do that isn't political. And it astonishes me that some people still think we might bring this empirical idea of research to work on race, to work on anti-racism, to work on settler colonialism. I just wonder how you navigate as researchers that somewhat bizarre suggestion.
I think it's quite challenging, actually, this kind of space, because, you know, there are debates about the role of research. There are debates about objectivity in research. The positivists are aiming to be objective. The constructivists are aiming to co-construct reality with each other, and the criticalists are trying to change reality, I think, you know, just sort of a very shorthand way of looking at it. And I'd say that my research comes from a criticalist perspective, which is trying to make a better society, looking at trying to make a more just society, a more fair society. And I think it's imperative for us to help that agenda and make recommendations based on our careful research, our rigorous research around what's going on and how to make things better. So I think it's responsible for us to do that. Otherwise, why are we doing the research? If we don't want to make the world a better place, why are we doing the research?
Yeah, no, I agree with Karen. And I mean, I think there's always a pushback around the issue of race and racism in most contexts. But as Sarah noted, in particular in relation to the Palestine issue, it is it's much more noticeable. And, you know, there's always accusations that fly and various things like that, which, you know, are things that you basically just have to just say, look, you know, I know where I stand. I know the politics of what I'm researching and things like that. And I think it's really important that, you know, solidarity in relation to anti-racism shouldn't be, you know, pick some and choose some and, you know, forget the others. There's within Palestine solidarity, I don't know if people have heard this terms, but there's often a term called PEPS, which is progressive except Palestine, progressive except for Palestine. And so it's like people see themselves as progressive on many, many, many issues on various things, and they will speak out against this. But when it comes to Palestine, they can't bring themselves to do that for whatever reasons it might be, because they don't either understand the issue or they have they're fairly emotively involved in their perspective in relation to it. So this is just something, you know, we have to navigate. And as an academic, it is sometimes a scary thing. You just have to, I quoted Stephen Salader in my talk, and he lost his job, a Palestinian, because he was very outspoken, and he was basically black banned from universities in the US. So, and that also happened to Norman Finkelstein, who was a Jewish scholar. The same thing happened to him because he was very pro-Palestine and spoke out and did research on Palestine. So, you know, these things can happen, and it can be tough. But I think that, you know, do we bow to that, or do we have the courage to do the research that needs to be done, and you know, be very clear in what our politics are? I mean, I think it's very important that we understand that if you are pro-Palestine or you support the Palestinian you know, struggle as an activist, that, you know, you're very clear about having clear anti-racism politics across the board, opposed to anti-Semitism, opposed to anti-Black racism, opposed to anti-Aboriginal racism. All of this sort of stuff is really, really important. And the same in researching. I think we have to be rigorous in our research, that when we're presenting these ideas and things like that, it has to be based on the research that we're conducting in a very rigorous way, because not just because of it is that issue, but all our research should be rigorous in every way. So, sorry, I'm rambling. I'll stop now.
You're not rambling at all. Thanks, Kim. Yes, certainly. You know, I won't be the first to observe that the Black Ink stable of publications, the Saturday paper and the Monthly, won't publish anything on Palestine, despite being very progressive publications. Otherwise, they have a bit of the pep about them. I want to shift now to I guess the questions that Karen raised, but again for both of you. Karen, you talked about the difference between the US being almost obsessed with talking about race, and then how in Australia no one wants to talk about race or even really acknowledge that race or racism is an issue or a problem. How do you think that those differences, or that ability or lack of ability to talk about race in Australia impacts the research that we're able to do here? And Kim, how do you see that play out internationally as well?
I think that there are pros and cons to having a carefully agreed upon racial classification system, which is what the US has. You know, there is largely agreement on what the racial categories are and who fits in them, although there's been some blurring in the sort of last 15, 20 years around some of the categories. Before that, I think it was much more rigid. But I think having those agreed racial categories reifies them. You know, race is a social construction, and the categories are made up. So having a reified system like that solidifies the idea of racial difference. And here, because we don't have that, except for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the rest of the racial categories are a bit more malleable. However, if you're an African person, a visibly African person walking down the street in Melbourne, racism follows you where you go. It happens all the time. And we don't have a way of speaking about that. We don't have a way of measuring that. We can't tell if we're making progress on that. And so that's the conundrum. We don't want to reify the categories, but we actually need to find a way of reducing the actions that are leading to people being disadvantaged in that way. And the reason I noted that we do track race, Indigenous and not Indigenous. And what we do with that tracking has historically been very problematic. And I'd say it comes out of our history of having a separate regulatory regime for Indigenous peoples than for non-Indigenous peoples. So you have your regulatory regime for Indigenous people separated in the Constitution, treated differently, things like Northern Territory intervention, stuff that Indigenous people are subjected to that other people in this country are not subjected to, no matter what their race. And that's incredibly problematic in the way that that's operationalized. So I think that that's the conundrum that we're in at the moment. And it also means that whiteness is invisible and the benefits of whiteness are invisible. And so there's a lot of, I had a colleague say to me a few years ago, not in this workplace, in another workplace, that they didn't think racism was a problem. A white man saying to me that I don't really believe that's an issue after hearing me give a talk. Thinking, of course you don't think it's an issue. You've never been experiencing it.
Exactly, yeah. It's not an issue for him.
Yeah.
And what do you say to that? Okay.
Shut up. Sit down.
Sarah, could I get you just to, slightly just reiterate the question again, please?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was about how we talk about race, whether as in the US, we have a hierarchy of race, but where everyone is obsessed with talking about race compared with somewhere like Australia, where much of the time, like Karen's colleague, people like to pretend that race is not an issue here. Just wondering how that's played out in your work and how you observe it in that international context.
Yeah, look, I think it is obviously an issue. It's different, as Karen has said. Just recently, in the course I'm lecturing in this semester, we just looked at the issue of the the one drop rule and blood quantum in the US, and I was saying to the students that here in Australia we don't have that, thankfully, sort of thing. But there's here in Australia we had at least 700 pieces of legislation historically, which had around 67 different definitions of who were and who wasn't Aboriginal at various different times in our society. So, that was often changed of who would be classified into those categories and who wasn't. And then obviously we have the impact of settler colonialism and colonization in Australia, and what that means for Indigenous communities. And of course we had the spectacle a few years of, Andrew Bolt and the famous case that was brought against him. So, these issues are live and they're important. And for me, as a light-skinned Aboriginal woman, it does play out in my life as, similar in some ways to what Karen was saying with her as well. My siblings and my mother are darker colouring than me. So, I could see as, just to give it an instance, I remember one time I hadn't been home for a while when my younger sister was very young, and I went home and one of her friends was really confused because she's like, how can she be your sister? She's white, sort of thing. And this was, 7-year-old kids or something like that. And so, so there's those issues there of, how you're perceived as to be Indigenous or not Indigenous. But within the context of, my work, it's generally being relatively okay. I think it's important to be able to make linkages, obviously, of identifying and being able to talk about, you know, the history of my family. And every Indigenous family, or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, is different. You know, what I can talk about as an Aboriginal woman is very different to, say, I didn't grow up in country. So that would be very different to what I speak about, is very different to what somebody else who has grown up in country can speak about. And I would never presume in any way, shape or form to talk about those experiences that haven't been part of what has helped to form my identity and things like that. Having said that, I also think that, you know, we don't want to get caught up necessarily in what's known as identity politics as well, because I think it is important to, you know, to be able to see the linkages, as I said, between different struggles and things like that. And that's really important to be able to do that. So yeah, so I don't know. So yeah, I haven't, work-wise, you know, I'm still fairly new in the academic game, to be honest. So I haven't had a lot of problems with it, but you know, I have had my experience of it on a personal level.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap up. We've only got 3 minutes left, but a quick final question, but one that I think is quite nicely forward-looking. A question for both of you on any advice that you might have for young people of colour trying to get involved in either activism or academia, or both, and any suggestions or advice that might help support those brave souls.
Just do it.
Just do it. Don't be frightened. Just get involved. I think, you know, find people in your local area to see what they're doing. Keep an eye out. There's, well, as we said, we're not as many demonstrations on the streets at the moment, other than the pro-fascist ones, so we don't really want you joining those. You know, there's activities that people can get involved in, and they shouldn't be afraid. And the same with research. I think you just have, if it's something you feel passionate about and you want to do, then you should do it. I know when I was doing my PhD, just to give an example, as great as my PhD supervisor was, and I won't say who it was, but he was fantastic. He wasn't keen on me taking a settler colonial approach to my studies, and I was just determined that I was going to do it, and that's what I wanted to do, and so I just did it, and I wrote what I wanted to do, you know. And obviously I appreciated the feedback and that I got from this very good scholar and with a long experience, but it was also important to me I couldn't see how I could study the issue that I wanted to study without applying a settler colonial approach. So to me, it was really important to have that approach as part of my research. So I just had to dig my heels in and I just did it.
I think that that's something that you do have to do sometimes. I also think that if you want to do this kind of work, you need to find a community to support, because it can be lonely sometimes. And so it's good that there are lots of people out there who are passionate about these topics, and I'd say that that's an important aspect.
Yes, I agree.
And I would just add that I think in any institution, even one that is as broadly white as the University of Melbourne, there are pockets of resistance and communities that include the ISRC, that include the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, that deliberately try and to engage in this politics and to engage in work that advances solidarity around anti-racism work in settler colonial societies. A lot of rave reviews in the questions and answers for both Karen and Kim. I think a lot of people have been quite moved and affected, and I think challenged around your presentations today. So a lot of gratitude from them, and a huge amount of gratitude from us to both of you. Thank you very much for your time, your wisdom, your insight, your reflections on your experiences. It's been a really fantastic session. And thank you to everyone who has attended this afternoon. The recording will be available and we look forward to your ongoing engagement in our work. Thanks everyone. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.